Otherwise, I have a very short video. Okay, so Unit 7 starts where we left off with the Baroque, right? Like if you remember, Unit 6, we left the Renaissance. We talked about mannerism, how it leads into the Baroque. We talk about the beginning of the Baroque, kind of the competition. We use like the sort of the rivalry between Carracci and Caravaggio to sort of represent the kind of like the big ideas of what the early Baroque was about. And then we followed those ideas up to about Poussin and Velasquez. And so in this lecture in Unit 7, we continue with the Baroque, but we go up to Holland and we start looking at a couple of other artists. We look at Vermeer and Rembrandt, and who are a little bit later, right? Like we're starting in the 1650s, which is basically where we left off with Velázquez. And then we're looking at both the careers of Rembrandt and the careers of Vermeer. And once again, there's a lot of Dutch Baroque artists that we could look at, and but we just don't have the time. We talk a little bit about Anthony van Dyck, partially because he was a student of Rembrandt, and so he was or student of Rubens, and how he kind of brought some of that teaching to other parts of Europe, and especially to England, to Britain. Um, and we talk a little bit about Pozzo and about and what we're really getting into is like this transition that becomes the Rococo. So we're getting to Tiepolo in 1750s. And so we have to understand the Rococo, though we have to understand how it started in France. So we talk a little bit about Poussin, and it's kind of go back to Poussin, right? And then we talk about Watteau, who is really kind of credited with founding the Rococo. And the Rococo is sometimes viewed as like the last phase of the Baroque. But other times, some art historians think of it more like a completely separate movement. So the Rococo, which was very kind of, it was accused of being frivolous, right? It was very much about the sensuousness and about pleasure and enjoyment. It was very much a a style of art that was for the the wealthy class, the nobility class. And and then we have the counter to that, which is neoclassicism. And primarily here we're talking about David. Um, Jacques-Louis David. That's how you would say it in French. We look at that word and we say David, but in French it is David. And so we're looking at the history of David's career, and strangely enough, I kind of end, right? Like I end here, but this image is actually more the beginning. So there you go. We also talk about Elizabeth Lebrun and a bunch of other artists who kind of like represent what was going on after the Rococo, and that kind of attempt by some artists to sort of find a synthesis between the influences of the Rococo and neoclassicism. Then we talk about what's going on in Britain and their versions of those kind of ideas. And then lastly, we talk a little bit about the idea of, was there such a thing as an art of the Age of Enlightenment, right? The Age of Enlightenment is definitely kind of like a phase in history and a phase in philosophy that we can see certain thinkers and say that, but was there a shift in the art? We talk about that a little bit. We talk about Joseph Wright of Derby. And by the way, in England, that's how you say that word. Looks like Derby, but they say Derby. Okay, then next we do a survey of printmaking. And printmaking, this will be the printmaking lecture is probably the most chock full of testable questions and testable ideas than of any lecture. Like there's, it's like I was thinking about the irony of that, of how I split up painting into two lectures, and that probably more than anything reflects my bias as a painter. And yet, really, like printmaking is so technical, and there are so many different kinds of printmaking, so much to discuss. I could have just as easily have broken printmaking up into two different lectures. And anyway, so we will, when we get to the printmaking lecture, we'll really focus on the difference between relief printmaking versus intaglio, and then the different kinds of intaglio and the different processes for those and the different effects that you get with the different kinds. One of the things that comes up again and again is this desire of printmakers to be able to create tone, to create like these even gradations of tone, like you could make in paintings. And so mezzotint is one approach to that. Aquatint is a different kind of approach to that. And in a way, you could also say that lithograph got at that, although lithograph was about other things as well. And screen printing. Okay. And so then let's see. Then the next lecture is about perspective space. We've talked a little bit about the design issue of space, but this lecture is just about pictorial space, the way two-dimensional images make the illusion of space. And perspective is one of those possibilities, but it's not the only one. So we start with that. We start with like different ways that pictures can make space. We look at some images where space is being made without any kind of perspective system at all. We also look at the counter kind of point of like other kinds of perspective systems. These are all examples of isometric perspective systems. We talk about the difference between isometric versus what's called linear perspective. Okay. And then we get to like 1 point linear perspective and 2 point. So this is 1 point and like 2 point linear perspective. And then we talk about some contemporary artists who really use perspective systems and the allusion to perspective systems to make artwork. And then the last lecture is about the study impulse, right? Which is about this idea that artists tend to be people who are into studying things because they're often aiming to get better at like their job of representation. Because generally that is the main thing that they have to do is they have to represent the world and the ideas of like the people who are paying them. And so there's just this ongoing tradition of artists who look very, very carefully at the natural world, at the physical world, at the body, and just who study um, everything intently. Okay, so that's unit 7, and I'll start working on that lecture or on those lectures in the next couple of days. But here is unit 8. No. Yeah, it's the same actually. Let's go to unit 8 here. And in unit 8, we talk about romanticism and we talk about photography. But the design principle that we talk about is visual pathways, or one of the design principles that we talk about. And so let's go from current slide. Okay, so this lecture you'll notice already it's a little bit different because it doesn't have like the full grid page and all the information. This lecture is really just about one main thing, and that is about how our eyes move through pictures. And to get us to kind of think about that as a metaphor, and like, but also as an actual physical thing about like anytime anytime we stand in front of a painting or we look at a photograph, the two things are true. One is that our brain has the illusion that we're looking at it as a whole, right? We look at a photograph and we think we kind of see the whole thing at once. But perceptual psychologists have told us that because they can study our eye movements and everything, that is not at all true. That when we look at an image, what we do is our eye scans through things, and there's certain paths that our eyes will follow, and that um, generally, like that, they find that with a lot of images, especially things like paintings and especially like really famous paintings that like clearly were very kind of like well composed and well thought out, that there's this tendency for almost everybody's eye path movements to be kind of roughly the same, right? That they kind of go over similar things, and when they get to here, they tend to go to there kind of thing. So let's start with um, with the idea about landscape painting, and then we'll talk about how that relates to other kinds of painting. So I thought there was one where go back. I thought there was one where I had it with a black background and everything. I should do that. So in this painting, if we look at it zoomed in, right, and really just kind of take it in, the thing about landscape painting in the Baroque in France at around this time, this is a Lorraine painting. So this is a little bit after, so Claude Lorrain is a little bit after Poussin, sort of like in the in-between period between Poussin and then we get to Watteau. So in this painting, and in French landscape painting at this time, it was very much a part of the thinking that the painting would function like a journey, right? That you design the image and the landscape, the image of the landscape and the idea of the landscape in the image. You design it to be about how we walk through the space. And so, yeah, there are these figures here, but it's also about this pathway that our eyes can follow. Look, there's a little path, and then we get to here, and we have to cross the river right there, right? But there's some rocks there that'll help us do it. We cross the river, and we get over here, and then somehow there's a path over there, and then before you know it, there's a path over here, and we're going across the bridge, right? And then that road's taking us somewhere back here, but it seems to turn around, and all of a sudden it's coming around here, and then it's taking us to the city. And then from the city, we get to the beach. And from the beach, we can get on a boat and we can go out that way. We can go all the way to that distant mountain. Okay. So the painting is designed to tell us the story of that journey, right? That's not the only part of the painting. I mean, a lot of it is just telling us what's going on here. And I will also point out there are some other kinds of visual pathways that are not about that journey. Like if you think about the way our eye can also move up here, like following the columns and up to the trees, and how if our eye follows that curve, it kind of takes us back to the same spot, right? To where the city is, the beach is, the ship going off to the distant mountain is all in that kind of region. So there's like another pathway that our eye could take to get there. This pathway isn't in space, right? It's more two-dimensional, just movement across the page. Okay, so this was a very common way of designing landscape paintings in the 18th century and 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 17th century to a degree. And so, like, let's look at, we've already seen this painting once before, Journey to Cythera by Watteau. And let's think about the journey that our eye takes, right? Like, there's very clearly a path that our eye follows in terms of the grouping of the figures, right? Like from this area here with this statue and this group of family, with little Puto angels flying around them. Um, we have the beginning, right? And then our eye follows this grouping, and then it goes to that group, and then it goes to this group. And then notice we even have this path of the little, those little kind of cherubs, they're called puto. Um, and they kind of like make an extra arc right there, right? And that's a path that our eye, kind of like a flowing, meandering path that our eye is going to follow. And it also is moving through the space and into the deeper space. And we can look at paintings that we've already seen and think about how they might work that way, right? Like we know that this painting to a large degree is about the diagonal and how it relates to the figure and the figure to this stuff and mostly about what's going on in the foreground. But we could also look at this painting as about the story of how he got here, right? We can see the donkey and we can see a little bit of like the turn going around the cliff right there. And then we can't really see a path or a road, but then we can start to see some roads back here, and then we can see a city, then we can see a castle, and then we can see even more distant hills, right? So our eye kind of follows this path, and that path tells us a little bit of the story of like what um, what St. Francis gave up to live the life of a saint, of a monk. Um, St. Francis founded the order of Franciscan monks, if you didn't know. And it also maybe tells us a little bit of the story of like where Francis is going to go after this moment, because he did many great things after kind of like having his sort of his revelation. And similarly, this painting by Giorgione, a lot of it is what's going on right here in the foreground, but our eye does also kind of follow the path of what's going on back here and going further and further into the distance. Now, not all landscapes function equally that way. Like to a large degree, this painting by Rembrandt really is kind of like stopped at this point. Like our eye can kind of go up to there, but can't go much further. And then we can imagine going around the bend on the river, but also a little bit blocked. Whereas the Dur has a much wider view, but we really can't clearly see how we get from here to back there, right? And so here with this painting by Vincent van Gogh, it's also very much about like the visual pathways is quite obstructed. Like we don't have any clear sense of how we get from this foreground into these fields here. Once we're here, we can kind of see this clear line that takes us kind of all the way back to the horizon line. But there is kind of an obstruction. But our eye, just because we can't imagine walking through the space all that clearly, doesn't mean that our eye can't flow through the space, right? So, because all the shapes flow into each other, we can definitely flow from here into there, right? So once again, getting to the point that like visual pathways, the way our eye moves through things, is not necessarily the same as that imagining of a journey. I think that kind of idea of imagining a journey is really a good place to start, but oftentimes the most interesting visual pathways are not ones that where you can literally see a path, right? So this is a great example of that because it's all very flat to the page, right? There's some distant space going on, but a lot of what's going on in this painting is very, very close to us. The visual pathway is very two-dimensional. It's very much like following these geometric lines, right? Like this main line going up here that leads us to this moment, this main line going up this way, right? See kind of like the big triangle that organizes the whole thing. And then these smaller kind of pathways, like the way we go from the horse sort of screaming, and how then this kind of shape that I don't really know what it is, how that leads us to the bull, right? And how that leads us then to the woman crying over the dead child, right? All of that is going on. Um, and there's kind of like a similar kind of secondary pathway going on over here. Right. And so these paths are not so much about going into the space, and they are definitely not literal kind of like places we can see ourselves moving through. Instead, they are just the journeys that our eye makes as it moves across the painting. And so that leads us back to this painting. If you remember, we had talked about this painting before when we were discussing hierarchy. Wonder why I can't get this bar to go away. There we go. So when we were talking about hierarchy, I talked about how it's kind of at first is very overwhelming and it seems like there's no hierarchy to excavation at all. It seems completely random and disorganized and impossible for our eyes to kind of like figure out. But if you give it some time and just stare at it, you can start to see that there is kind of an organization. There are things that start to emerge, senses of imagery, but also sense of like where there are zones where thing shapes get larger and where there are zones where the shapes get smaller. And if you think about as a visual journey, seems very much about meandering, but also kind of circular, right? But then there are also clear kind of like paths between like short, choppy little paths, but between section to section. Okay. All right. Just as a follow-up, because we have time, on visual pathways, I'll also talk about emphasis just a little bit. and focus. So we talked about emphasis when we originally talked about um, hierarchy and emphasis, but I want to talk a little bit more about it. The reason why this comes up in Unit 8 is because of photography, and we're talking about the actual use of focus and depth of field as a way of directing our attention, right? So like here's an example where like the amount of sharp, crisp focus compared to there really changes how much our attention is focused on her versus how much time we spend looking at that boy who's on the stilts, right? Or a similar kind of shift in that Cindy Sherman. And so these, or like the way our attention is on these men and then the deep space going to the city behind. So, um, in this lecture, I want you to think about like ways that we create focus, right? And so like sharpness and and detail are definitely one of them, and also value contrast, right? See how like the increased amount of value contrast, especially the increased amount of darker values, but we still have lots of light values as well, but we have lots of dark values in this region. And then how, if we look, compare like this to this region here, we have less value contrast in general. Yes, mostly it's lighter. We don't have anywhere near as many dark darks, but also the lights aren't all that as light as some of the lightest lights up there, right? So using value contrast as a way, using detail, using sharpness of edge, right? And there are other ways of creating emphasis, such as position, right, and color, and then having lines, like lines directing our attention to certain areas, and of obviously scale. And then I want you to think about the difference between focus and emphasis versus dominance, right? What tends to make some shapes or some sections of shapes dominant in a composition? And so when I think about the difference between dominance and subordinates, right, as one kind of design principle versus hierarchy and emphasis. Hierarchy and emphasis is often about like the moments, right? Small little sections and how our eye is drawn to them, right? Whereas dominance is about which shape is more important. So, a really good example would be black square, red square right here, where black square is larger, the black square is higher, the black square is darker, and that provides a lot of dominance. Now, the red square has a more intense color, but overall, I would say the black square is more dominant. The red square is subordinate to it. But our our attention, the area of focus, is neither the black square or the red square. It is right here. It is the intersection, the connection between the two. It is the the dialogue between the two, right? And similarly, in Mondrian's painting, right, the red is the dominant shape, but that doesn't mean our eye scans the whole red shape, right? The red is the dominant shape, and all the other shapes are subordinate to the red. But the area of focus is the area of most drama and most activity, and that's right there, the white, the black, the blue, and the red, right? That's where the action is happening. And so that's the area of most attention. Okay. I'm going to skip that because we've talked about it a lot. And I think that I don't need to go into that much more about any of these other than like this is a good example. Andy Goldsworthy, just different ways of drawing our attention to things. And I'll go over when we get to Unit A, might go into a little bit more depth about this, but for right now, the main point here is just to get you to think about how in these paintings, there are different ways of drawing our attention to areas and different ways of thinking about which shape is dominant, which shape is less dominant. Okay. And that's the end. So, Elia, do you have any questions?
I don't think so. I just wanted to make sure I haven't done a whole bunch of these. To sign into the chat, do I just put my name?
Yeah, or just right here. It should, and since your name is already there, like
Okay, that'll work.
If you just type here, then the only time I ask people to like make sure they sign their name is like if your identity like is like, well, to give you an example, there are two students in the class who are named Jasmine, and when they're generally on their phone, so both of them show up as Jasmine's iPhone.
Oh, okay.
So like I ask them to sign in full name so I know which one is which.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I did that right.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. That's a good question. Any other?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, it's about 7:30 your time, 8:30 my time. So you have a good rest of your night. And like I said, starting tomorrow, I'll start recording videos on Unit 7.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Night.